Welcome to The Humble Podcaster, the podcast where we help you follow through on your dreams of creating your own show by providing practical knowledge, tips, and tricks on podcast production. I'm your host, Chris Hill. Today is an exciting day. We're sitting on the Launchpad for your show. As with any launch, there's a lot to do prior to liftoff. So in this episode, we're going to walk through what we need to do in order to get your show into orbit. The first thing we need to do is get the proverbial rocket to the launch pad. Of course, for that to happen, we also need a launch pad. And by that I mean we need a podcast host. A podcast host is a service where you upload your audio and the host distributes your show to whatever podcast directories you choose to distribute to. A directory could be Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or really wherever you listen to podcasts. The best baseline for this comes from Podnews, which, in addition to being a great news source for the industry, has some great tools. You can find their list of recommended directories in our show notes. If you already happen to have a show, you can even use their search page to look up your show and verify that you're where you need to be. We'll also include a link to that in the show notes too. As you may have already discovered, there are tons of podcast hosts to choose from when you start your show. The options can seem limitless, and everyone appears to cost about the same. So how do we know which one is best for you? When choosing a host, I recommend first looking at your podcast's objective. The reason for this is that your objective for the show will dictate a lot of what you should consider in a host. For instance, if your goal for the show is to get a large audience and eventually grow through ad revenue, you'll want to ensure that your podcast is hosted on a platform that is IAB or Interactive Advertising Bureau certified and offers some sort of dynamic ad insertion. For that direction, Omny Studio, Libsyn, and Podbean are great hosts to consider. I have personally managed shows on both Omny Studio and Podbean. I can tell you that Podbean is definitely better for a beginner. It has more beginner-friendly services, such as a built-in website and an app-centric audience, and will help you get your show up quickly. Omny is definitely more complex, and if you don't know what you're doing, you're likely to miss registering some podcast services. They also don't have that nice built-in website option. If advertising isn't that important to your show, or you just don't like the idea of dynamically inserted ads, then I recommend Transistor. It is hands down the easiest platform to use for podcasting. I use Transistor for the work we do at HumblePod as well, and I really like their application. My one word of warning is to make sure that you use a third-party podcast tracking application like PodTrack to keep tabs on your content. Transistor is IAB compliant, but they are not IAB certified. This means they follow the IAB standards, but they have not been certified by IAB. This may not matter much until your show is way bigger, but it's worth setting yourself up properly from the start. Thankfully, they make integration with PodTrack, which is a third-party IAB-certified podcast tracking service, a breeze when you're ready for that step. At this point, I know some of you are asking, wait, hold up, what about Anchor? Aren't they the easiest podcast host available? Technically speaking, yeah, kinda, yeah, I mean, sure. Yeah, absolutely. And guess what? They're free. But free comes with a cost. You see, when you launch a show on Anchor, they take care of all the hard stuff for you. That includes registering your show on multiple podcast directories such as Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Of course, they're owned by Spotify, so you're guaranteed to have them registering your content on their platform. The problem with this is that you don't own any of that registration information. Should you grow out of Anchor, as I just frankly highly recommend you do quickly, you'll find your show's registrations are all tied to Anchor. If you're already on Anchor, my recommendation is to do what you can to get control of your content now. Thankfully, they do provide instructions on this within their help center, but you don't want to be put in a situation where you need to move away and can't do it. Another problem with Anchor that I've run into is that they have the ability to shut down your show if they feel your content violates their terms of service. This isn't just relegated to people who equate quote-unquote free speech with racist and bigoted comments either. It means if you have a music podcast that plays too much music, they can shut you down because what you're doing interferes with Spotify. Even if you have all the proper rights to use the music, they can still do this with little to no warning. The worst part is that some of this process is apparently automated as well, and I'll link to an article referencing this in the show notes. So, before you get too deep into all the nifty tools, ask yourself, why would I want to be a part of a platform that may automatically delete not just an episode, but my entire account along with my audience? Just give it some thought. Hopefully you won't have to think too hard about that one. Once you've decided on your podcast host, aka the Launchpad for your show, it's time to start our pre-launch checklist. It's at this point where you're going to be glad you did all that pre-work for your show, so pull out your notes and get ready to go. Every podcast needs 3 pieces of content in order to launch. Number 1, audio in MP3 format. We did that in our last episode, so you can just go ahead and check that off. Number 2, podcast information. And number 3, podcast art. So what podcast information do we need for your show to go live? I've created a simple checklist that should help you with this process. And if you're wondering, please remember this is also a blog post and a newsletter as well. If you'd like to view this information in writing, please visit the website at humblepod.com/podcasts. Podcast information checklist. Podcast description of 500 characters or less. This is why we do all the hard work at the beginning of this process. You should have your messaging down, and you can use that to write this description. This is essentially the written version of your trailer. It's what everyone will read when they're trying to understand what your podcast is and why they should listen to it. Podcast website. If you're creating a podcast for an existing business, make sure you link your podcast to your website's blog page at a minimum, because that's where you should be posting this content if you don't buy a domain specifically for your show. Or do like I did and buy a domain and redirect it to a landing page or blog page on your website. If you plan on building out a website, either choose a podcast host that will host a website for you, or create a simple website on WordPress, or a simple to use platform like Squarespace, who is not sponsoring this episode in any way, shape, or form. I just wanted to say it like that. Primary and secondary show categories. Your podcast host will have a drop-down list for you to choose from here, but if you want to plan ahead of time, I'll include a link to Apple's list of current categories in our show notes. Pick your category according to all the planning you've done so far. If it doesn't fit into a perfect category, don't worry too much. Just pick what works best. Sometimes those categories can be tricky. For instance, when I was doing our Humble Beer podcast, I had to put us in art, food, because there was no craft beer subcategory. And food and art felt like what craft beer really is at the end of the day. Explicit rating, yes or no. Will you drop F-bombs on your show, or will you keep it clean? It's the internet. You can say whatever you want to, but whether or not you choose to bleep that word will ultimately guide a lot about your show. What I have found in all my years of podcasting is that people are open to self-censoring if the expectation from the outset is that you're a PG or PG-13 show. If your ultimate goal for this show is to be a business development tool, my recommendation is to mind the language. Limiting language has, in my experience, helped to make sure the content stays focused and professional. If you're producing a show for entertainment, then I'll leave that up to you. You've done the research on your audience, and if you think they'll be okay with it, then don't let me guilt you into self-censoring your content. Show keywords. Again, refer to all the planning you've done so far. Pick from what we've built already. In general, you need 5 to 10 keywords for your show. Now, it's worth noting here that Apple has stopped indexing these, so it's less important than it used to be, but still worth putting in for your show. Okay, so that's the core of what you need for podcast information. Pretty straightforward, pretty simple, right? This is all we need to get this show online. You'll also need episode information to get your trailer up, so we'll jump into details of what you need there as well. This is where things get really complicated and frankly a little ugly with podcasting. You see, every podcast directory interprets the description tag in your RSS feed differently. This, in turn, means that the information you create for an episode will look different depending on what directory you're on. For example, if you have a show in Transistor, they very kindly break out the episode summary, which uses the iTunes summary tag, from the full description and show notes, which uses the description tag. This is great because Apple reads the episode summary or the iTunes summary tag as basic text, no HTML formatting included. Therefore, embedded links will disappear. Within the full description and show notes, Apple reads that information separately as formatted text, and it includes that as the description for the show that you see within the app itself. This does include embedded links and any simple formatting, bold, underline, or italics you want to include. But Spotify reads this information completely differently. From Transistor, it appears that they strip some of the links and formatting on some shows, but not for others. In contrast to this, Podbean and Omni both have only one field to fill for the episode description, and it includes all the formatted text you need for a show. In the places that accept formatted text, that is. For places that accept the iTunes summary tag, it simply copies what's in the description tag, meaning your formatting in those places will be unformatted, even if they need bullet points, etc. So, what I'm saying is that it can get really confusing. What matters here is that you optimize each episode description for the top podcast players, ideally Apple and Spotify. Now, this may take some trial and error to get the formatting right on your part, but here are a few notes on what I have found works well. For now, until Apple or Spotify or your podcast host sneezes and everything changes again. Number 1. Make sure your episode description is in the episode summary and full description and show notes if you're using Transistor. Since they're both shown in different places, it'll ensure your summary is showing up properly. If you want to include timestamps for show notes, use parentheses around numbers like open parentheses 1:23 close parentheses. On Spotify, this will allow the listener to jump directly to that timestamp. Number 3, avoid embedding URLs. I know it doesn't look great, but some players just don't play nice, and leaving the URL long will allow people to highlight the text and copy-paste it into a browser. Number 4, keep everything simple. Don't overdo it on content writing, and make sure things are as easy to read as possible. At this point, it's worth noting these challenges are also part of the case for having a dedicated blog post per episode. That way, regardless of what the podcast host and directory decide to do with your content, you'll have final creative control over it. A website post can be a great place to add additional visual elements to your episode and even post transcripts. Speaking of transcripts, I know a lot of people want to know whether or not they should include these with their show. In general, I think it's a good practice for accessibility. There are some people out there that love you, but won't ever listen to your podcast, either because they don't know how to listen or they just don't like the format. A transcript helps bridge this gap for those people who might just want to read the content you're producing and not listen to it. In addition, being an audio-only source, a transcript allows your podcast to be accessible to the hearing impaired. And it's always good to make your content as accessible as possible. Transcripts are also a great SEO tool. Here's why. You're going to be taking at least 30 minutes to an hour with every show you're doing for an interview podcast. The average spoken word per minute is around 150. Therefore, you're generating 4,500 to 9,000 words for a blog post in that time span. That's some solid content for your website. If you want to do a quick transcript, I recommend using Descript because it's also a fantastic editing tool for beginners, as I've noted in the past episode. And if you're looking to go beyond that, Rev also does well if you're looking to have a human element in that transcription process as well. Just make sure your show isn't too technical, as I've learned that transcriptionists are not the best with tech terminology. Once you've got all that together and ready to go, we just need one final thing: podcast art. Podcast art can be as simple or as complex as you want it to be, as are a lot of things in podcasting. If you're looking for a quick and easy way to execute on podcast art, I recommend just getting an account with Canva. They have some great templates on there that you can choose from, and it's just easy to use. Beyond that, you could look at a service like 99 Designs to care for your design needs, or just hire a graphic designer if you don't already have one. As for the design specs, you'll need a square image for your podcast if you haven't already figured that out. It should be exactly 3,000 by 3,000 pixels, or Apple won't accept it. I've run into the same problem submitting apps to the Apple App Store too. Be precise or it won't work. Also, keep the content simple and clear. Remember, people will see this as a tiny square on their phone in most cases, so design with visibility in mind. You might also want to create an alternate design so you can have a version of your cover art with the episode title included. This is recommended, but certainly not required. And finally, leave the bottom 15% of the graphic, or about 450 pixels high from the bottom, free of any important text, as it gets frequently hidden by podcast players. Now that we've walked through the pre-launch checklist, we're ready for the final countdown. Let's make sure we've got everything in order. Podcast information, filled out on the podcast host. Art, designed and uploaded. Audio, mastered in MP3 and uploaded for the trailer. Now that we have everything good to go for launch, we are ready for podcast liftoff. But don't get too excited. We're not done yet. This is a 2-stage rocket, and we've just completed the first stage. We have an RSS feed where we can point the podcast directories, and that's definitely a great first step for podcasting kind, but certainly not the last one. Next, we need to register your show on all those podcast directories. This will take some time, and it's one of the reasons that the podcast launch is a multi-stage process. Apple can take 3 to 5 days to register your show, so we need to start with them, get an Apple ID, and get on Podcast Connect and register your RSS feed. From here, I advise following your podcast host's set of recommended podcast directories. I'll also include a list of my top 10 recommended podcast directories in the show notes. These directories are the ones I recommend based on industry analysis and the size of their audiences. In fact, I think if you get your show in these top 10 hosts that I list, you're in a safe spot for starting your show. As it turns out, many other hosts pull from Apple's podcast directory. For instance, Overcast will add your show automatically once it's indexed in Apple Podcasts. And many other podcast directories do this too. So don't think, quote, registering your show everywhere, unquote, means that you need 30 plus logins. That said, I do encourage you to register everywhere your audience is. So if you see data showing that they're on a podcast app that you're not currently registered with, go there, establish your show, and get registered. Having an account gives you access to advertising opportunities too, and data that you might otherwise never see. So if you're feeling up to the task, take that list from Podnews that I mentioned earlier that's in the show notes. Just go crazy. Register everywhere. But if you don't, and you only want to use my recommended list, you'll be more than fine. Once all the registration's complete, we are officially in orbit. At this phase, you can start to promote your show on social media and let everyone know you have a podcast. Because remember, podcasting is opposite Fight Club. The first rule of podcasting is that you tell everyone about your podcast. The second rule of podcasting is that you tell everyone about your podcast. From here on out, it's all about promoting your show and producing new episodes. Which brings me to your homework. For your homework, you need to get your show launched as we discussed. Once that's up, your show is live and you will have officially completed launching your podcast. Congratulations. I'm proud of you for sticking with this. And that brings us to the end of the How to Start a Podcast series. It's been quite the adventure, and I hope you've learned a lot. As you've seen, there's a lot to learn. If you have any questions for getting your show launched or podcast production, my team at HumblePod is ready to help. You can reach out to me at chris@humblepod.com or by filling out the contact form on our website. Thank you for listening to The Humble Podcaster. You can keep up with the latest on the podcast at humblepodcaster.com, and be sure to follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts. If you want to connect with us on social media, you can find us at HumblePod on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And remember, stay humble, stay on course, and keep on podcasting.
This has been a HumblePod production. Stay humble.